Canada has a particular relationship with prosperity that most countries never develop. The country is so large, so resource-rich, and so geologically varied that entire towns get built on a single bet. Not a diversified portfolio. Not a calculated hedge. A single bet. One mine. One mill. One commodity price on a futures exchange in a city 3,000 kilometers away. When the bet pays off, the town becomes a place people brag about moving to. The schools are good. The hockey arenas are funded. The wages are the highest in the region, and everyone who lives there has a plausible reason to believe the arrangement is permanent. When the bet loses, the town becomes something else entirely. This list is about what that something else looks like. 12 Canadian towns that, at their peak, had more money per capita than most cities in the country. 12 towns where the prosperity was real, the confidence was earned, and the collapse was thorough. The question is not whether these places deserved better. Most of them did. The question is whether anyone saw it coming. Most of them did. That is the part nobody talks about. Number 12, Tumbler Ridge, British Columbia. Tumbler Ridge is the town that almost disappeared so completely it nearly validated every criticism ever made about resource-dependent communities in Canada. Then it did not. That makes it the most instructive entry on this list. The town was built from scratch in 1981 by the provincial government of British Columbia at a cost of approximately $500 million. The logic was clean. Northeastern British Columbia had significant metallurgical coal deposits. Japan had signed long-term supply contracts. A purpose-built town would house the workers, a rail line would move the coal, and the whole arrangement would pay for itself inside 20 years. At its peak, in the mid-1980s, Tumbler Ridge had approximately 4,500 residents. The median household income was among the highest in the province. The town had a swimming pool, an arena, a hospital, and a golf course. It was not an improvised camp. It was a planned community with deliberate infrastructure and a budget that reflected serious government confidence in a commodity contract signed on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. The catch arrived in 1990 when the Japanese steel industry contracted and the long-term agreements that had justified the entire investment were not renewed. By 2000, the population had dropped to approximately 1,900 people. The hospital closed. School enrollment collapsed. Property values fell so sharply that houses were functionally worthless. The provincial government watched $500 million in infrastructure investment become a liability in roughly a decade. Picture this. It is 1985. You are 28 years old, and you have just accepted a job at one of the Quintet or Bull Moose mines. Your starting wage is more money than you have ever made. Your rent is subsidized. The town around you is new enough that the paint on the community center still smells fresh. You drive to work on roads that were built 2 years ago. Your mortgage payment is less than what your friends in Vancouver pay for a parking spot. You believe with evidence that you have made a good decision. Then the contracts expire and the belief becomes something you do not talk about at the dinner table. Tumbler Ridge survived because coal prices recovered in the 2000s and dinosaur fossils turned out to be a legitimate tourism asset. The recovery was real. It was also not the plan. Number 11. Elliott Lake, Ontario. Elliott Lake called itself the uranium capital of the world, and for approximately 2 decades, that claim was not exaggeration. It was accounting. The town sits in northern Ontario, roughly halfway between Sudbury and Sault Ste. Marie. Uranium was discovered in the area in 1953, and by the late 1950s, Elliott Lake had 12 operating mines and a population approaching 25,000 people. The federal government was buying uranium for the nuclear weapons programs of its allies. The town was not just prosperous, it was strategically important. Houses were built, schools were filled, and a community formed with the particular confidence of people who believed their industry was literally powering the future. The catch had 2 chapters. The first arrived in 1960 when the United States ended its uranium purchasing contracts, and the town's population dropped from 25,000 to approximately 6,500 in roughly 3 years. Mines closed. Families left. The infrastructure remained. The second chapter arrived in the 1990s when the last operating mines exhausted their economic viability and closed permanently between 1990 and 1996. Picture this. It is 1957. You have just transferred to Elliott Lake from a mining camp outside of Timmins. The difference is immediately visible. There are paved streets. There is a shopping center. There are schools with enough students to field sports teams. Your paycheck reflects the fact that the government genuinely needs what you are pulling out of the ground. You feel, for the first time in your working life, like a person with economic leverage. The leverage expired before your mortgage did. Elliott Lake reinvented itself as a retirement destination in the 1990s by marketing its cheap housing stock to seniors. The reinvention was partially successful. The town exists, but it exists as something entirely different from what $500 million in uranium revenue built. Number 10. Port Alberni, British Columbia. Port Alberni is the town that British Columbia's forestry industry built and then quietly stopped maintaining when the returns started declining. The town sits at the end of Alberni Inlet on Vancouver Island, roughly 2 hours west of Nanaimo. For most of the 20th century, it was one of the most productive forestry communities in Canada. Macmillan Bloedel operated sawmills and pulp mills that employed thousands of people at wages that, by the standards of the time, made Port Alberni genuinely wealthy. The company built employee housing. It funded community facilities. The entire local economy was organized around what the mills needed and what they produced. The peak population was approximately 20,000 people in the 1970s. The median household income was among the highest in British Columbia, outside of Greater Vancouver. Mill workers owned boats, took vacations, and sent their children to university. This was not a struggling resource town. This was a place where the resource was paying generously, and everyone who lived there had decided the arrangement was durable. The catch is automation and commodity price compression working simultaneously over 30 years. Macmillan Bloedel merged into Weyerhaeuser in 1999. Mill capacity contracted. Employment declined not in one catastrophic closure but in a series of gradual reductions that were each individually manageable and collectively devastating. Picture this. It is 1974. You work the morning shift at the pulp mill. The smell of sulfur is permanent and you stopped noticing it 18 months ago. Your take-home pay every 2 weeks is enough to cover your mortgage, your truck payment, your boat insurance, and still leave enough for dinner out on Friday. The inlet outside your kitchen window turns pink at sunrise. You have not seriously considered living anywhere else because there is no financial reason to. The financial reason arrives slowly. That is actually the harder version of this story. Number 9. Iroquois Falls, Ontario. Iroquois Falls is what happens when a single company owns an entire town and then decides the town is no longer economically necessary. The town in northeastern Ontario was essentially created by Abitibi Power and Paper Company in 1914. The company needed workers for its pulp and paper mill on the Abitibi River. Rather than importing labor into an existing settlement, it built one. The result was a company town in the clearest possible sense. The company owned the houses, the stores, and the infrastructure. The mill employed the population. The population existed to serve the mill. At its peak, the operation employed approximately 1,500 people in a town of roughly 6,000 residents. The wages were competitive, the housing was maintained, and the arrangement worked for as long as global demand for newsprint remained strong enough to justify Northern Ontario production costs. The catch is that global newsprint demand did not remain strong enough. Digital media reduced newspaper circulation. Advertising revenue migrated online. Abitibi Boarder, as the company became after a series of mergers, filed for creditor protection in 2009. The Iroquois Falls Mill reduced capacity and employment repeatedly across the 2000s. The town's population declined from approximately 6,000 to under 4,500. The tax base contracted. Municipal services became harder to fund with each successive year. Picture this. It is 1988. You are a third-generation mill worker. Your grandfather helped build this town. Your father spent 35 years on the floor and retired with a pension. You are 31 years old, and you have every reason to expect the same trajectory. The mill hums outside your window 24 hours a day. The sound is so consistent that silence would alarm you. The mill slowed down in ways that the sound did not immediately reveal. By the time the silence was audible, the pension fund was under pressure, and the trajectory had changed in ways that a third generation of loyalty had not prepared anyone to handle. Number 8. Flin Flon, Manitoba and Saskatchewan. Flin Flon is named after a fictional character in a dime novel, which is either charming or an omen, depending on which decade you are reading about. The town straddles the Manitoba-Saskatchewan border in a geological formation so rich in zinc, copper, and gold that it attracted Hudson Bay mining and smelting in the late 1920s. By the time the mine and smelter reached full operation, Flin Flon had approximately 10,000 residents. The company built houses on Canadian shield rock by blasting flat surfaces and constructing directly on the stone. The town has no basements. There is nowhere to put them. The houses sit on top of the rock that made the whole enterprise possible, which is a detail that functions as either a metaphor or an engineering constraint, depending entirely on your perspective. Peak prosperity in the 1960s and 1970s meant high wages for underground mining work, a stable, if isolated community, and an economy that moved in lockstep with global base metal prices. The catch is a mine that has been operating for nearly a century and is measurably running out. The ore grades have declined. The economically accessible deposits have shrunk. Hudson Bay Mining and Smelting, now owned by Swiss mining giant Glencore, has reduced employment repeatedly. The population has declined from approximately 10,000 to under 5,500. The smelter that processed ore for decades closed in 2010. Picture this. It is 1968. You work underground and you come home to a house built on rock. Your neighbor works underground. His neighbor works underground. The paycheck is good enough that none of you think carefully about what the rock is gradually becoming as you extract it. The rock is the job. The job is the town. The rock does not run out in a single moment. It runs out in a long arithmetic of declining ore grades and rising extraction costs that takes 50 years to complete and arrives so gradually that no single year feels like the year everything changed. Number 7. Leaf Rapids, Manitoba. Leaf Rapids was designed by architects. That should have been the warning. The Manitoba government built Leaf Rapids in the early 1970s as a planned instant community to house workers for the Sherritt-Gordon mine at nearby Rutan Lake. The design was deliberate and award-winning. The town center was enclosed, connecting residential buildings to commercial space through covered walkways so that residents could move through winter without going outside. This was not improvised. This was a government decision to build a model northern community from first principles, and the result reflected genuine ambition. At its peak in the 1980s, Leaf Rapids had approximately 2,500 residents. The housing was good. The infrastructure was intentional. The community had arts programming, a recreation center, and civic buildings that reflected serious investment in the idea that resource extraction could coexist with quality of life. The catch arrived in 2002 when Hudson Bay Mining and Smelting closed the Rutan Lake mine. The reason was familiar: ore grades had declined. Metal prices were insufficient to justify continued extraction at the site's operating costs. The mine closed with approximately 2 weeks of formal notice to the community. The population declined from 2,500 to under 500 within a few years. Picture this. It is 1979. You live in a northern Manitoba town that is warmer inside than any northern Manitoba town has a right to be. The covered walkways mean that in February, when the temperature outside drops to -30, you can walk from your apartment to the grocery store to the recreation center without putting on a coat. You think this is what the future looks like. You are describing this to your mother on the phone, and she does not quite believe you. The mine closed with 2 weeks' notice. The covered walkways are still there. They connect a fraction of the population they were designed for. The architecture survived. The economy did not. Number 6. Schefferville, Quebec. Schefferville is the town that the Iron Ore Company of Canada built because it needed workers and then abandoned because it did not. The town sits in the Labrador Trough in northern Quebec, accessible by rail and nothing else. Iron ore was discovered in the region in the 1940s, and the Iron Ore Company of Canada constructed Schefferville beginning in the early 1950s as a fully serviced community for mine workers. At its peak in the 1970s, Schefferville had approximately 4,500 residents. The town had hospitals, schools, hotels, and the particular infrastructure of a community that expected to be permanent. The wages were high. The isolation was real. The trade-off was understood and accepted by thousands of families who moved to a town accessible only by a 570-kilometer rail journey from Sept-Îles. For 20 years, enough people decided the cost was acceptable. The catch arrived in November 1982. The iron ore company announced the closure of its Shefferville operations. The mine shut down the following year. The company provided relocation assistance to its employees. The town's non-indigenous population left with a speed that local observers described as disorienting. Within 2 years of the closure announcement, the non-indigenous population had dropped from approximately 3,800 to fewer than 300. Houses were left with furniture inside them. The company's infrastructure was largely abandoned in place. Picture this. It is 1975. You arrived in Shefferville by train because there is no other way to arrive. The journey took 12 hours from Sept-Îles, and you watched boreal forest give way to tundra somewhere north of Labrador City. Your paycheck is the best you have ever received, and the cost of everything in this town is higher than anywhere you have lived before. The math still works. The math has worked for 20 years. The iron ore company ran the math differently in 1982. The math they ran did not include you in the answer. Number 5. Sydney and Glace Bay, Nova Scotia. Cape Breton's industrial communities did not fail quickly. They failed across 150 years, which is almost more impressive. Sydney was once the site of the largest steel plant east of Hamilton. Glace Bay was the center of one of the most productive coal mining regions in Canada. Together with the surrounding communities of New Waterford and Dominion, they formed an industrial complex that, at its early 20th century peak, employed tens of thousands of workers and produced coal and steel that built the country. The Sydney Steel Corporation, known universally as Cisco, employed approximately 3,500 people in the 1960s. The coal mines of Cape Breton had employed over 10,000 miners at various peaks. The wages were competitive. The communities were established. The identity of the region was indistinguishable from its industry. The catch is a century-long mismatch between an industry that kept requiring more subsidy and a government that kept providing it rather than forcing a transition. Cisco was nationalized by the Nova Scotia government in 1967, specifically to prevent its closure. The government spent approximately $3 billion in subsidies over the following 30 years to keep a steel plant operating that the market had been trying to close since the 1960s. The result was not survival. It was a prolonged and extremely expensive version of the same outcome. The stack stopped burning in 2001. The harbor site became one of the most contaminated pieces of industrial land in Canadian history, requiring approximately $400 million in environmental remediation that is still ongoing. Picture this. It is 1962. You work at the steel plant, and your father worked in the mines. The stack has been burning since before you were born. The harbor moves with ore ships and coal carriers. Sydney is not glamorous, but it is employed. There is a distinction between those two things that only becomes apparent when one of them disappears. One of them disappeared. The other is still trying to figure out what comes next. Number 4. Faro, Yukon. Faro is the town that went broke 3 times and kept coming back, which sounds like resilience and is actually a description of the Yukon's limited options. The town was established in 1969 to service the Anvil mine, at the time one of the largest open-pit lead-zinc operations in the world. Cyprus Anvil Mining Corporation built the town and the mine simultaneously. At its peak in the 1980s, Faro had approximately 4,500 residents. The wages for lead-zinc mining were exceptional. The Yukon government depended on Faro's economic activity for a significant portion of its territorial revenue. The town had a modern recreation center, a hotel, a bowling alley, and the particular prosperity of a place where the resource is valuable enough that the remoteness becomes affordable. The catch is commodity prices, and in Faro's case, commodity prices failed catastrophically and repeatedly. The mine closed in 1982 when metal prices collapsed. It reopened in 1986. It closed again in 1993. It reopened in 1993. It reopened in 1993 under new ownership. It closed permanently in 1993 when the operating company went bankrupt. The final closure left behind approximately 70 million tons of mine waste, requiring perpetual environmental management at an annual cost of approximately $10 million. The mine is not operating. The waste management is expected to continue indefinitely. Picture this. It is 1981. You live in Faro, and the Anvil mine is the largest employer in the territory. Your household income is higher than most of your university-educated friends in Vancouver. The Yukon River is 40 minutes from your back door. The northern lights are so consistent in winter that you have stopped photographing them. The remoteness that once seemed like a sacrifice has become something you prefer. The mine closed the following year. It reopened. It closed again. The third closure was permanent. The lights are still remarkable. The paycheck is not available and has not been available for a generation. Number 3, Cobalt, Ontario. Cobalt discovered enough silver in 1903 to briefly make it one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in North America. The silver is gone. The town is still there, wondering what to do about the distance between those two facts. The town sits in the Timiskaming district of Northern Ontario, 2 hours north of North Bay. When prospectors discovered silver deposits during the construction of the Timiskaming and Northern Ontario Railway, the response was immediate and overwhelming. By 1908, Cobalt had approximately 10,000 residents, dozens of operating mines, and was producing enough silver to influence global commodity prices. Mine owners became millionaires. The town built banks, hotels, and a financial district appropriate to its sudden importance. The silver was so abundant and so close to the surface that men were pulling it out of the ground by hand in places. The wealth was not theoretical, it was visible and immediate, and it made cobalt, for a brief window, genuinely important in ways that Northern Ontario had never been before and has not been since. The catch is that silver deposits can be genuinely exhausted. Cobalt's veins were rich but shallow and discontinuous. Production peaked around 1911 and declined steadily through the 1920s. By 1930, the primary silver rush was functionally over. The population had fallen below 2,000. The hotels closed. The financial district became a row of empty buildings. What had been a legitimate economic force inside 20 years became a historical record. Picture this, it is 1909. You are a mine owner in a town that did not exist a decade ago. Your operation employs 40 men and produces enough silver that you have opened a bank account in Toronto specifically for the excess. The streets are muddy. The buildings are temporary. Everyone intends to stay until the silver runs out, and almost nobody believes the silver will run out. The silver ran out. The population today is approximately 1,100 people. The Tourism Board calls Cobalt Canada's original silver city, which is accurate. It describes a place that exists primarily in the past tense, which is also accurate. Number 2, Uranium City, Saskatchewan. Uranium City had 5,000 residents in 1981. It had approximately 100 in 1984. That is not a typo. That is the fastest documented depopulation of a Canadian town in the records that have been kept reliably. The town sits on the north shore of Lake Athabasca in northern Saskatchewan, accessible by air and by seasonal winter road. Eldorado Nuclear built the community in the 1950s to service uranium mining operations for the federal nuclear program. At its peak, Uranium City was a genuinely functional northern community, with schools, a hospital, a hotel, grocery stores, and a recreational infrastructure that reflected serious investment. The wages were high. The work was federally guaranteed. The isolation was manageable because the income made it manageable. There was a logic to the arrangement that felt, to the people inside it, like the most reasonable version of life available. The catch arrived in November 1981 when Eldorado Nuclear announced the closure of its Uranium City operations. The announcement came with relocation packages and a timeline that gave the town approximately 6 months. The response was not gradual. People left as soon as they could arrange it. The population that had stood at 5,000 in 1981 was below 200 by 1984. Houses were left with furniture, appliances, and personal effects inside them. The hospital equipment remained. The schools still had textbooks on the desks. The grocery store shelved its remaining inventory and locked the door. Picture this. It is 1979. You live in a town that most Canadians could not locate on a map. This does not bother you because your mortgage is small, your income is large, and the lake outside your window is clean enough to drink from. The isolation is real, but you have built a community inside it. Your neighbors are also Eldorado employees. The federal government is your employer's employer. You have decided, with evidence, that federal backing makes this permanent. Eldorado Nuclear made a different decision in 1981. The houses are still standing. The furniture is still in some of them. The town has fewer than 100 people, and a winter road and a history that Saskatchewan's tourism materials describe as remarkable, which it is, in the specific way that catastrophes are remarkable when you are reading about them from a sufficient distance. Number 1. Cassiar, British Columbia. Cassiar does not exist. Not in the way that Uranium City barely exists, or Shefferville thinly exists, or Cobalt exists in the past tense. Cassiar was physically demolished. The buildings were bulldozed. The materials were sold for salvage. The town that had 3,000 residents and a functioning asbestos mine was removed from the ground with the same efficiency that the mine had removed chrysotile from the rock. The town was built in northwestern British Columbia in the early 1950s by Cassiar Asbestos Corporation. The asbestos mine was one of the most productive in Canada. At its peak, Cassiar had approximately 3,000 residents, a modern town site with a community center, a curling rink, a hotel, a hospital, and the infrastructure of a place that expected to be permanent. The wages were competitive with any industrial operation in the province. The location was remote, even by northern British Columbia standards, accessible primarily by the Alaska Highway and then a secondary road north, but the income justified the distance for thousands of families who made the calculation and decided the math worked. The catch is asbestos. The global understanding of chrysotile asbestos as a carcinogen that kills with a latency period of 20 to 40 years after exposure was not news in 1992 when the mine closed. The science had been developing since the 1960s. The regulatory pressure had been building since the 1970s. International markets for Canadian asbestos had been contracting for years. The mine closed in January 1992. The company liquidated. The town site was assessed, and the assessment determined that the most economically rational outcome was demolition. By 1995, Cassiar was gone, not abandoned, not emptied and left to decay, demolished. The curling rink, the hotel, the community center, the houses where families had lived for 30 years. The salvage value of the materials was applied to the cost of the liquidation, and the remainder was settled in bankruptcy proceedings. Picture this. It is 1985. You have worked at the Cassiar mine for 12 years. Your children were born in the hospital that is 4 blocks from your house. You coach their hockey team in the arena that your employer built. The mine has been operating since before your children existed and will operate, as far as you can determine, after you retire. You have never thought seriously about living anywhere else because the mountain provides and the mountain is not going anywhere. The mine closed in 1992. The town was demolished in 1995. There is a highway sign where the turnoff used to be. The sign notes that a town once stood there and provides the dates of its operation. It does not describe the curling rink. It does not describe the curling rink. It does not describe the hospital where your children were born. It does not describe what it means to have the place where your family's life happened. Reduced to a highway sign with accurate dates and no other permanent record. Closing. These 12 towns had different industries, different decades, different governments, and different geographies. The pattern underneath all of them is the same. Single industry dependence does not fail gradually. It fails at the speed of a board decision. The prosperity is real while it lasts. The confidence is earned. The infrastructure is built in good faith by people who had every reasonable basis for believing the arrangement was durable. And then someone in a boardroom in Toronto or Zurich or Washington runs a different version of the math, and the town finds out what it was actually built on. Not rock, not ore, not timber. A contract, a commodity price, a government program with a sunset clause that nobody in the town was told about. The places on this list are not cautionary tales about ambition or greed or poor planning. They are accurate descriptions of what happens when an economy is a single point of failure, and that point fails. The question is not whether it can happen again. There are towns in Canada right now that are one board decision away from becoming the next entry on a list like this one. The only real variable is whether anyone in those towns is asking which board and which decision. Most of them are not asking. The prosperity tends to make the question feel unnecessary. That is the mechanism. It has always been the mechanism. The market will eventually price in the risk. The only question is whether the town is still there when it does.